So before we move on into the deeper structures of the telencephalon, I want to talk a little bit about the association cortices. So the association cortices are those cortices that are not primary. So it's not primary motor, it's not primary somatosensory, it's not primary audition. They're the areas in between those which comprise most of the cerebral surface of the human brain. They're largely responsible for complex processing, so they take all of this information and process it, and they may be what you might refer to as the seat of cognition. So let's move deeper into the telencephalon and take a look at the limbic system. So that's it in blue, but let's see how we get there from the outside of the brain. So again, we have the rostral or anterior portion of the brain here, the caudal portion of the brain here. Here is our precentral gyrus, which is primary motor, our postcentral gyrus, which is primary somatosensory. So let's get rid of that. Okay, so this is all on the outside. Let's get rid of that and move into the limbic system. So here you have an important structure called the cingulate gyrus, and I want to show you where that is relative to the rest of the cortex. So I'm going to bring back the cortex here. Let's see, brain. Okay, and let's hide this. Oops, hide. Okay, and you see here, okay, what we were just looking at, the cingulate gyrus right here. So it lays deep inside. This would be the central sulcus here, right? And this is the primary motor, primary somatosensory. So just underneath that is your cingulate gyrus. Now let's get rid of the midbrain here, okay? And here you have what we saw yesterday, the corpus callosum. So you get a sense of where that limbic system resides. So let's look at some of the other structures of the limbic system. Okay, so here we are again. Let's get rid of the outer cortices there. And again, you have the cingulate gyrus, and you remember that was just above the corpus callosum here. So let's move around this way. So now you're looking dead on the front of the brain here. Okay, what you have here, well, let's look midline first. You have, we won't talk about the indusium griseum. That I think that's for medical neuroanatomy. So we have the fornix here, which then terminates on the mammillary bodies that are there. One of the most important, so we think of the limbic system as the emotional brain, and certainly argument could be made for that. And in fact, it was in the late 1930s, and your book refers to this, that that a researcher named James Reyes, or I'm sorry, Papes, James Papes, first thought that there must be some structures that give rise to what he referred to as the emotional brain and an emotional experience. And so he identified these structures, and since then it's been changed a little bit. Some have been added, some have been taken away. And we'll get to, this doesn't describe all of what's in your book, and we'll get to that, but let's talk about this. So we know, the hippocampus is part of the limbic system. Is it part of the emotional brain? It's really more involved in memory formation than emotional content. But it is part of this limbic system. Now, the very important part of the emotional brain that gives rise to emotional behaviors is this small nucleus here. It's actually a bit larger than that, I believe, called the amygdala. And this is really what gives emotional tone to the flight or fight response. So you have a lot of signals coming up from your reptilian brain, down here from the brainstem, and it is the amygdala then that adds emotional content to that, so that you have an approach avoidance. You approach things that give you pleasure, and you avoid things that that will cause you pain. So you have your amygdala here, your hippocampus is right there, then your fornix there, feeding down into the mammillary body there. And again, you have your cingulate gyrus here. So in green here, we have the some of the cortical structures that give rise to the hippocampal formation or the processing of emotions, including the parahippocampal gyrus and the cingulate gyrus. You also have orbital and medial prefrontal cortex that are involved as well. So let's move this up and take a look at the inner structures. Whoops, sorry about that. Okay, slowly move this up. There we go. Okay, you have your hippocampus here, and I know you're not catching all of that, but you can in your book. The hypothalamus is also involved in these processes, and we'll talk about that at greater length later. Some of the nuclei of the thalamus, so here's your thalamus here, and your thalamic nuclei, particularly involved in the limbic system, is the medial dorsal nucleus of the thalamus and the anterior nucleus of the thalamus. And again, here you have your fornix, which we saw earlier, leading down to your mammillary body here. Okay. So I want to move now into the basal ganglia, which will be the last area I'll cover in this video on the telencephalon. So let's get a, pardon me, a sense of where that is. So here we are again. We're looking at rostral, caudal, dorsal, ventral, anterior, posterior, superior, inferior. So let's get rid of some of these external structures. So again, this is the postcentral gyrus, the precentral gyrus, primary motor, primary somatosensory, and let's get rid of that. Okay. And we'll get rid of this here, being the cingulate gyrus. Okay, here we are. So deep into the brain is what we call the basal ganglia. It's comprised of three primary structures. That would be, as you come in, so this is midline. You're looking at the middle there. So let's go back to the side again, anterior, posterior. So this structure here is your putamen. It's the first thing. So if you're slicing from the outside in, from the temporal lobe in, the first thing you're going to hit is the putamen. The next structure you'll hit will be the caudate nucleus. Okay, and you see where that is there. And this is what we refer to as the head of the caudate. Underneath those structures is the globus pallidus. There and there. So two of these structures together, the caudate and the putamen and the caudate, are what's referred to as the striatum or the neostriatum. Those two structures are very much implicated in Huntington's disease. So it's the loss of GABAergic neurons in the striatum, meaning the caudate and the putamen, loss of GABAergic neurons that leads to the motor deficits that you see in Huntington's disease. So that alone gives away some of the function of the basal ganglia is the involvement in movement. Two other structures that are that interact strongly with the basal ganglia, not considered part of them, but part of circuits that are very important for motor control. The first is the subthalamic nucleus, and the second is the substantia nigra. And both of those circuits are involved not only in motor control, but also in some of the cognitive functions. I want to kind of show you where the basal ganglia is relative to the midbrain. So let's see if we can't find the midbrain out there. So we're back to the surface of the brain, and let's kind of get rid of that. So refresh view. Oops, I didn't want to do that. I want to go back to the cerebrum. Maybe it won't let me do this. It's not going to let me do this. So let's go to the basal ganglia. Okay. Okay, so let's try this again. So now we're looking at, I should keep it oriented the same, so let me see if I can turn this around. Um, Otherwise, I'm going to confuse you between rostral and caudal. So rostral or anterior, caudal, posterior. So here you have your temporal lobe, and we want to get rid of that. And here's your midbrain right there. And so let's see. So you have your hippocampus. Remember, you have your hippocampus here. You have your cingulate gyrus here. Okay, so let's get rid of the midbrain to see if we can find the basal ganglia. And this is important for a very good reason. So here we go. Here's the putamen. So midbrain is intimately associated with the basal ganglia. The reason that's important is it's the substantia nigra, the subset of nuclei in the midbrain that contain the dopaminergic neurons that project to the basal ganglia that are involved in Parkinson's disease. So it's that loss of those neurons, and I can't show that again. It's the loss of those neurons in the substantia nigra in the midbrain then that participate in the motor deficits seen in Parkinson's disease, and that's all tied up with the basal ganglia. So these first couple of videos wrap up, at least for me, the discovery of the telencephalon. That doesn't mean I've covered all of it. I'm sure I've missed something. Your book covers a great deal of it. You will be responsible for the major structures and the major functions. The next video will move into the diencephalon. So you remember there's telencephalon, which is comprised of the cerebral cortex and the basal ganglia, part of the hippocampal formation, or part of the limbic system. And then the diencephalon, then we move into the thalamus and the hypothalamus.